Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Sunday, August the 2nd, 2020.
All one's got to do is listen to Swing Low, Sweet Chariot and ask yourself what that song's about. Or try to really listen to what Ray Charles is really telling you. We have lived under these intolerable conditions for how many years? Nearly 400 years. We have evolved a certain kind of style to meet it, and a lot of that has been involved with the lies we had to tell to you, and the lies we had to tell to you, this compounds and is asked to you believe because you wanted to believe it. But obviously you knew, every white man knows, that he would not himself, lying track for nothing. He would not himself allow his child to be sold from him as though the child were a mule. He would not himself allow himself not to have the autonomy of his own house and his own woman. He would not himself pick all that cotton and carry it to market just because he loved white people. We all know that. And the word Negro in this country really is designed finally to disguise the fact that when it's talking about another man, a man like you, who wants what you want, and insofar as the American Republic wants to think there has been progress, they overlook one very simple thing. I don't want to be given anything by you. I just want you to leave me alone so I can do it myself. And it also overlooks another very important thing. Perhaps I don't think that this republic is the summit of human civilization. Perhaps I don't want to become like Ronald Reagan or like the president of General Motors. Perhaps I have another sense of life, which in fact my situation here has forced me to trust. And perhaps I know more about you and your institutions than you know about me. And perhaps I have a judgment on them. Perhaps I don't want what you think I want. And if there's nothing you can give me, perhaps there is something that I can give you.
That was James Baldwin from the Dick Cavett Show in 1969. James Baldwin would have turned 96 years old today. On this, his birthday, on this episode of The Politicrat, a look at some of the speeches and debates and television appearances of James Arthur Baldwin. Next. Welcome back. Continuing now with James Baldwin on his birthday. This would be his 96th birthday today, August the 2nd, 2020. James Baldwin was an activist, a poet, a writer, an author, a thinker, an intellectual, a philosopher, a debater, a scholar, an anti-racist educator. James Baldwin really was an anti-racist educator, a film critic, and so many other things that he has done and he did do in his time on this planet. He wrote at least 20 books, one of which, most famously, The Fire Next Time, is regarded as one of his classic works, the most classic of all his works. And he's also written such books as Blues for Mr. Charlie, Another Country, Go Tell It on the Mountain, A Rap on Race with Margaret Mead, Giovanni's Room, Notes of a Native Son, No Name in the Street, and a number of other books as well. Baldwin really did become one of the great intellectuals, and I think for all of the kinds of celebrations around him, I still don't think he gets the kind of credit that he really should get. I think he is one of the greatest and most important figures of the 20th century. One of the top 10 of the 20th century for sure. And certainly in the United States in the top 5 intellectuals of all time in the United States. A philosopher, a very wise and shrewd man. James Baldwin was born and raised in Harlem, USA in 1924. There's also a book that he wrote called If Beale Street Could Talk. That book was adapted into a film back in 2018. It was released. It was Barry Jenkins who directed the movie. James Baldwin is one of the most quoted people on the planet as well. And his legacy and his name continue to be evoked. He can still be found all over YouTube. And in 2016, the filmmaker Raoul Peck directed a documentary entitled I Am Not Your Negro, which featured James Baldwin in archival footage and the narration of Samuel L. Jackson as Baldwin himself. There were clips, as I said, of Baldwin from archival footage, and there were readings from an unfinished manuscript he'd been writing in 1979 and never did get to finish. He was able to write 30 pages of it, and it was called Remember This House. Samuel L. Jackson talks in the film through Baldwin as the voice of Baldwin. In fact, he is Baldwin in the present tense for the sake of the documentary that Raoul Peck did, which is a very important documentary. It's one of the superb film making feats I've ever seen. The film is available on Netflix, by the way, and I'm sure on other platforms. It had recently been televised here in the United States on PBS stations. There may well be links to it on PBS that you may be able to still watch. And I Am Not Your Negro is certainly available to download from iTunes, or at least from the Apple Store, Apple Music, or whatever the system is that you can download from Apple from, but it's available. Baldwin was an activist, as I said, and had lots of friends in Hollywood and in political circles as well. He knew Malcolm X very well. He was a good friend also to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and to Medgar Evers, who, of course, was head of part of the NAACP. James Baldwin debating William F. Buckley at the Cambridge Union at Cambridge University in Cambridge, England. And he now is James Baldwin.
Debate: James Baldwin versus William Buckley. Subject: has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro? This debate was held recently at the Cambridge Union, Cambridge University, England, and was recorded for use by NET.
It is now with very great pleasure and a very great sense of honor that I call Mr. James Baldwin to speak third to this motion.
Now we have Mr. James Baldwin, the star of the evening, who has been sitting, listening attentively, getting a wonderful reception here in the Cambridge Union. Tremendous enthusiasm from all sides of the House for Mr. Baldwin, who has been listening to the arguments. Now will bring the voice of actual experience to the debate.
Good evening. I find myself, not for the first time, in the position of a kind of Jeremiah. For example, I don't disagree with Mr. Burford that the inequality suffered by the American Negro population of the United States has hindered the American dream. Indeed, it has. I quarrel with some other things he has to say. The other, deeper element of a certain awkwardness I feel has to do with one's point of view. I have to put it that way. One's sense, one's system of reality. It would seem to me that the proposition before the House, when I put it that way, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro, or the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, is a question hideously loaded, and that one's response to that question, or one's reaction to that question, has to depend on the effect on where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is, what your system of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions which we hold so deeply as to be scarcely aware of them. A white South African, or a Mississippi sharecropper, or a Mississippi sheriff, or a Frenchman driven out of Algeria, all have, at bottom, a system of reality which compels them to, for example, in the case of the French exile from Algeria, to defend French reasons for having ruled Algeria. The Mississippi or the Alabama sheriff, who really does believe when he's facing a Negro boy or girl that this woman, this man, this child must be insane to attack the system to which he owes his entire identity. Of course, for such a person, the proposition of which we're trying to discuss here tonight does not exist. And on the other hand, I have to speak as one of the people who've been most attacked by what we must now here call the Western or the European system of reality. What white people in the world, the doctrine of white supremacy, I hate to say it here, comes from Europe. That's how it got to America. Beneath, then, whatever one's reaction to this proposition is, has to be the question of whether or not civilizations can be considered as such equal, or whether one civilization has the right to overtake and subjugate and in fact to destroy another. Now what happens when that happens? Leaving aside all the physical facts which one can quote, leaving aside rape or murder, leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression, which we are in one way too familiar with already, what this does to the subjugated, the most private, the most serious thing this does to the subjugated, is to destroy his sense of reality. It destroys, for example, his father's authority over him. His father can no longer tell him anything because the past has disappeared, and his father has no power in the world. This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic, and in the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime, so that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end. Now, we're speaking about expense. I suppose there are several ways to address oneself to some attempt to define what that word means here. Let me put it this way, that from a very literal point of view, the harbors and the ports and the railroads of the country, the economy, especially of the southern states, could not conceivably be what it has become if they had not had, and do not still have indeed, and for so long, so many generations, cheap labor. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. This, in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And no one can challenge that statement. It is a matter of historical record. In another way, this dream, and we'll get to the dream in a moment, is at the expense of the American Negro. You watch this in the Deep South in great relief, but not only in the Deep South. In the Deep South, you are dealing with a sheriff or a landlord or a landlady or the girl of the Western Union desk. And she doesn't know quite who she's dealing with, by which I mean that if you're not part of the town, and if you are a northern nigger, it shows in millions of ways. So she simply knows that it's an unknown quantity, and she wants to have nothing to do with it. So she won't talk to you. You have to wait for a while to get your telegram. Okay, we all know this. We've been through it. And by the time you get to be a man, it's very easy to deal with. But what is happening in the poor woman, the poor man's mind, is this. They've been raised to believe, and by now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible their lives may be, and their lives have been quite terrible, and no matter how far they fall, no matter what disaster overtakes them, they have one enormous knowledge and consolation, which is like a heavenly revelation. At least they are not black. Now, I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to white Southerners is in some ways, after all, much worse than what has happened to Negroes there. Because Sheriff Clark in Selma, Alabama cannot be considered, no one can be dismissed as a total monster. I'm sure he loves his wife, his children. I'm sure that, he likes to get drunk. He's, after all, one's got to assume, and he is visibly a man like me. But he doesn't know what drives him to use the club, to menace with the gun, and to use the cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast, for example. What happens to the woman is ghastly. What happens to the man who does it is in some ways much, much worse. This is being done, after all, not 100 years ago, but in 1965, in a country which is blessed with what we call prosperity, a word we won't examine too closely, with a certain kind of social coherence, which calls itself a civilized nation and which espouses the notion of the freedom of the world. And it is perfectly true from the point of view now simply of an American Negro. Any American Negro watching this, no matter where he is, from the vantage point of Harlem, which is another terrible place, has to say to himself, in spite of what the government says we can't do anything about it. But those are white people being murdered in Mississippi work farms, being carried off to jail. Those are white children running up and down the streets. The government would find some way of doing something about it. We have a civil rights bill now. We had an amendment, the 15th Amendment, nearly 100 years ago. I hate to sound again like an Old Testament prophet, but if the amendment was not honored then, I don't have any reason for believing the civil rights bill will be honored now. And after all, one's been there since before, a lot of other people got there. If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now?
James Baldwin at the Cambridge Union debate at Cambridge University in Cambridge, England, debating William F. Buckley, the conservative. That was in 1965. James Baldwin would be 96 years old today. This is his birthday, August the 2nd. There'll be more from James Baldwin coming up next.
That in the same way, the moral life of Alabama sheriffs and poor Alabama ladies, white ladies, their moral lives have been destroyed by the plague called color, that the American sense of reality has been corrupted by it. At the risk of sounding excessive, what I always felt when I finally left the country, found myself abroad in other places, and watched Americans abroad. And these are my countrymen, and I do care about them. And even if I didn't, there is something between us. We have the same shorthand. I know, when I look at a girl or a boy from Tennessee, where they came from in Tennessee, and what that means. No Englishman knows that, no Frenchman, no one in the world knows that except another black man who comes from the same place. One watches these lonely people denying the only kin they have. We talk about integration in America as though it was some great new conundrum. The problem in America is that we've been integrated for a very long time. Put me next to any African, and you will see what I mean. And my grandmother was not a rapist. What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history. I was there not only as a slave, but also as a concubine. One knows the power, after all, which can be used against another person if you've got absolute power over that person. It seemed to me when I watched Americans in Europe that what they didn't know about Europeans was what they didn't know about me. They weren't trying, for example, to be nasty to the French girl or rude to the French waiter. They didn't know they hurt their feelings. They didn't have any sense that this particular woman, this particular man, though they spoke another language and had different manners and ways, was a human being. And they walked over them with the same kind of bland ignorance, condescension, charming and cheerful, with which they'd always patted me on the head and called me shine, and were upset when I was upset. What is relevant about this is that whereas 40 years ago when I was born, the question of having to deal with what is unspoken by the subjugated, what is never said to the master, of having to deal with this reality was a very remote possibility. It was in no one's mind. When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree. If you walk out of Harlem, ride out of Harlem, downtown, the world agrees. What you see is much bigger, cleaner, whiter, richer, safer than where you are. They collect the garbage. People obviously can pay their life insurance. The children look happy, safe. You're not. And you go back home. And it would seem then, of course, that it's an act of God, that this is true, that you belong where white people have put you. It is only since the Second World War that there's been a counter-image in the world. And that image not come about through any legislation on the part of any American government, but through the fact that Africa was suddenly on the stage of the world, and the Africans had to be dealt with in a way they'd never been dealt with before. This gave an American Negro for the first time a sense of himself beyond a savage or a clown. It has created, and will create, a great many conundrums. One of the great things that the white world does not know, but I think I do know, is that black people are just like everybody else. One has used the myth of Negro and the myth of color to pretend and to assume that you are dealing essentially with something exotic, bizarre, and practically, according to human laws, unknown. Alas, that is not true. We are also mercenaries, dictators, murderers, liars. We are human too. What is crucial here is that unless we can manage to establish some kind of dialogue between those people whom I pretend have paid for the American dream and those other people who have not achieved it, we will be in terrible trouble. I want to say at the end, at the last, is that is what concerns me most. We are sitting in this room, and we are all, at least we like to think we are, relatively civilized, and we can talk to each other at least on certain levels, so that we could walk out of here assuming that the measure of our enlightenment, or at least our politeness, has some effect on the world. It may not. I remember, for example, when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said that it was conceivable that in 40 years in America we might have a Negro president. And that sounded like a very emancipated statement, I suppose, to white people. They were not in Harlem when this statement was first heard, and did not hear, and possibly will never hear, the laughter and the bitterness and the scorn with which the statement was greeted. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barbershop, Bobby Kennedy only got here yesterday. And now he's already on his way to the presidency. We've been here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years, if you're good, we may let you become president. What is dangerous here is the turning away from anything any white American says. The reason for the political hesitation and in spite of the Johnson landslide is the one that's been betrayed by American politicians for so long. And I'm a grown man, and perhaps I can be reasoned with. I certainly hope I can be. But I don't know, and neither does Martin Luther King. None of us know how to deal with those other people whom the white world has so long ignored, who don't believe anything the white world says and don't entirely believe anything I or Martin say. And one can't blame them. You watch what has happened to them in less than 20 years. It seems to me that the city of New York, for example, this is my last point, which has had Negroes in it for a very long time. If the city of New York were able, as it has indeed been able, in the last 15 years to reconstruct itself, tear down buildings and raise great new ones, downtown and for money, and has done nothing whatever except build housing projects in the ghetto for the Negroes. And of course the Negroes hate it. Presently the property does indeed deteriorate because the children cannot bear it. They want to get out of the ghetto. If the American pretensions were based on more solid, a more honest assessment of life and of themselves, it would not mean for Negroes, when someone says urban renewal, that Negroes simply are going to be thrown out into the streets, which is what it does mean now. This is not an act of God. We're dealing with a society made and ruled by men. If the American Negro had not been present in America, I am convinced that the history of the American labor movement would be much more edifying than it is.
Welcome back. Today is James Baldwin's birthday. He would be 96 years of age today. James Baldwin passed away in 1987. James Baldwin is one of the great American heroes, actually. And I just, again, have said this before, I don't think he gets nearly the credit that he really should. I really think he should get much more credit. James Baldwin, as I said, is someone who is an intellectual. He had, and you may know this, he had lived in France to get away from some of the really difficult situations in the United States, to say the least, in the 1950s and into the 60s, some of it. Baldwin had remarkable how do you put this? This is remarkable prose. And someone who gave us a lot to think about when it came to racism, and also to the way that white society treats black people. And forces us to look squarely, in addition to race, really the fundamental human responsibilities that people have, particularly in this case, white people. And this is some of the things that Baldwin really hit home on in a number of his writings and his speeches and his television appearances. One of the books that he did was a film critic's book, really, a film criticism book. The book, The Devil Finds Work, which was released and published in 1976, took a really strong look at the lens of American society through the movies that Hollywood produced and released. And it was very revealing. Gone with the Wind was on the menu, and Dance Fools Dance, many other movies that really told the story of race, of what's beautiful and what's not, what's rejected and what's not, what's embraced and what's not. This is a very, very important book, by the way. All of James Baldwin's works are. But The Devil Finds Work, which is a film that really is, excuse me, I keep saying a film, it's a book in which James Baldwin analyzes some of the most heralded Hollywood films and looks at them on a political and socio-economic and sociological level. I mean, he really does analyze these films so very, very well and very keenly, and also on racial grounds in terms of the racial juxtaposition and the messages that are being sent about the films that he describes and what they mean and what they stand for vis-a-vis the country. So I urge you to go ahead and buy, or however you do it, read The Devil Finds Work. It's a very good book. And read the other books I've also recommended. So here now, again, is James Baldwin arguing his side here in the debate at Cambridge University against William F. Buckley.
To the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until the moment comes when we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
James Baldwin getting a standing ovation for his, debate, his position. He was debating about the American dream and the Negro, as black people were called back then in 1965. At the time of this debate, Malcolm X had already been murdered. I mean, this is the backdrop. That same year, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. He was killed on February the 21st, 1965. This debate, I believe, was October of 1965. So we're talking just 8 months later. By the way, I'll just give you a spoiler alert here. James Baldwin won the debate before the Cambridge Union at Cambridge University. And the question was originally, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro? Well, I think you can tell what the answer is. James Baldwin really is one of the great fathers of this country in terms of not just the education, but the sense of really getting to the heart of what the issues are. And he did it again in the debate that you just heard. Black people, as he so well argues, are not even just, they're just not at all wards of the state in that way. They're not charity cases. We want the 40 acres and the mule, if anything, that you promised us, but we are not these appendages who just are hanging around here being ne'er-do-wells. We built this land. We built this country. You stole it from the Native Americans, and you kidnapped us and brought us here against our will. And you said, here, go build this land up again. And we did that, for hundreds of years. So we built the country. We're not some charity case. Oh, let's just throw some money at you. We built the country that you are running in power in, that you are running, that you are using your power in. We built that foundation. We built the whole damn thing. So this isn't some outsiders. We are in the house. That house is made of our blood, sweat, and tears. That's what James Baldwin is arguing. It's a very important point, and there are many others in that debate, and you can watch the entire debate with Buckley's responses and answers as well, if you wish. But I wanted to because, of course, today is James Baldwin's birthday, his 96th birthday. I wanted to play what he had to say. In a moment, I'm going to play one more piece of audio from James Baldwin before going into, of course, the two states. There's still 2 states to be done as we go toward closer and closer to Election Day. My goodness me. We are just 93 days away. But first, when I return, James Baldwin in another clip. Next. Welcome back. So now I'm going to play you one more clip of James Baldwin. This is from 1963, so we jump back 5 years. An interview that James Baldwin did at the Florida Forum in Miami for WCKT television in Miami, Channel 7. Again, 1963. At this time, both Malcolm X and Dr. King were alive. I know Medgar Evers was killed in 1963. So, I think that's very important to look at these dates here and who was here and who was not. So, here you go. This is part of James Baldwin here in Florida Forum in 1963.
Why does it have to be violence? Why can't it be something other than violence?
Well, and part of the reason one is doing one's best to avoid violence. But one of the reasons that it could happen that way is because for so long, for 100 years, the American Republic in general has ignored and denied the whole situation that Negroes have operated within. To be a source of cheap labor, for example, North or South, is to be, in effect, oppressed. Now, the oppression is bad enough, But the myth that the country is created about the objects of the oppression, the myth about the Negro being happy in his place, is something the Republic has managed to believe. And so that in addition to the fact of oppression, one has also the fact that within the country for 100 years there's been a way of life occurring in the country which most of the country knows nothing about. And this is reflected, for example, in the way Negroes talk to each other. It's a kind of language which does not really exist on what we like to think of as a major level of the American culture.
Right, but hasn't there been a lethargy on the part of the American Negro for that 100-year period, too, along with the white supremacy attitude?
I don't think so, no. I think that's, again, part of the myth. One's got to remember, after all, this may sound very rude, but you got to remember who wrote the history books and toward what end. I have never known a lethargic Negro. I've known a great many demoralized Negroes, but that is not the same thing. The truth is the Negroes have been fighting for this 100 years to obtain their rights, but and the country has ignored it. And the technique of the country has mainly been to accommodate it or to contain it, but never really to change the situation. And what has happened in our time in these last few years is that it's no longer possible to contain it. And the technique of accommodation has broken down. For the first time, really, the situation is now in the open, and no American can ignore it, as has been true up until, let us say, 1954.
All right.
And that situation continues, folks. I mean, this was amazing. I mean, this was almost 60 years ago now James Baldwin spoke those words. 1963. I mean, that was 57 years ago. No American can ignore the situation now. Well, no American can ignore the situation now in 2020. And you are beginning to see a cross-section of white people, which I still would say is under 30% of the white population in the country, who are putting their bodies on the line or certainly are protesting vigorously in many parts of the country. That was James Baldwin on the Florida Forum in 1963. I really urge you to go and watch I Am Not Your Negro, the Raoul Peck documentary on James Baldwin and his life. There are a number of other documentaries out there, but I would certainly start with that one, I Am Not Your Negro. An Academy Award nominated documentary. James Baldwin was a very special figure, an American hero, an American legend. Somebody who instructed this country and instructed white people to do better, and also had word for black people as well. But James Baldwin definitely is one of the iconic figures, one of my personal heroes, I must add. Never got to meet him, but certainly was familiar with who he was and knew him well in terms of his books, reading his books. Phenomenal books. So James Baldwin is a majestic and towering figure in American history and history period. So that is really all you need to know about James Baldwin, but the recommendations for his books are endless, as I've read to you the many book titles of James Baldwin, at least some of them. Go Tell It on the Mountain, Blues for Mr. Charlie, Notes of a Native Son, The Devil Finds Work, Giovanni's Room, Another Country, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, The Price of the Ticket, If Beale Street Could Talk, No Name in the Street. Those are just a number of films that books that James Baldwin wrote. I mean, these are incredible books that you really should read. Really should read those. Happy birthday, James Baldwin. Happy birthday. Before I go into the two states on this edition, I want to just let you know of something that you can be a part of. Yours truly will be appearing on Zoom this coming Friday, August the 7th, as part of the Mechanics Institute's Cinema Lit series for August, Black Lives in Film. The first film in the series for the month of August is none other than I Am Not Your Negro, the documentary by Raoul Peck that was released in 2016 and was nominated for an Academy Award the following year. One prerequisite for the discussion that I will be hosting on Zoom at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern this coming Friday, August 7th, is that you do watch the movie before Friday's event. If you haven't seen it, you really should. It would be helpful. If you have seen the movie, well, watch it again. I will be discussing the film and James Baldwin this coming Friday on Zoom as part of the Mechanics Institute's Cinema Lit film series, Black Lives in Film. The Mechanics Institute is in San Francisco, and if you would like to participate in this 1 hour exercise, please go to milibrary.org/events. That's milibrary.org/events. There you can register for free to be a part of the conversation. This coming Friday, August 7th at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. Join me then. Now, Iowa. For Iowa voters, you will want to head to the following website, sos.iowa.gov. That's samoscarsam.iowa.gov. When you get to the webpage, you will see the Secretary of State, Paul D. Pate. He will be smiling at you, and you will see a seal of the state of Iowa as well. Now, on the right-hand side of that website, you will scroll down to some fine print. It will say featured resources in red, and then below that, you will see business services, and below that, you should see elections in fairly bold print. I guess it's kind of bluish, grayish, but it's small, fine print. I was on the right-hand side of the site. You will see it there if you just scroll down just a little tad. Really, not very much at all, but it's there. Under elections, you will see a series of choices that you could click on if you want to request an absentee ballot, if you want to find out if you are registered to vote in Iowa, if you want to register to vote in Iowa, if you want to track your absentee ballot, if you want to find your precinct or polling place. Now, since really the focus is to look at registering to vote and checking your voter registration, you can click on registering to vote. If you want to register to vote, you click on that and you can go from there. You follow the prompts. On your left-hand side of that web page that you get to, you will see something that says online voter registration. And on the right-hand side, you will see something that says download a voter registration form. So you can do either one of those two things. If you want to do that and return it to the local county auditor in Iowa. So there are all kinds of things about voter registration information. If you are not registered to vote, learn how to pre-register, know the requirements to vote on election day, learn how to update your registration. So there's a lot of things there, including a tutorial about registering to vote that lasts for 2 minutes and 15 seconds. How about that? It's a video tutorial. In fact, there's 2 of them. So I think that that's helpful. Enormously helpful, actually. There's issues of restoring voting rights if you want to learn about that, voter ID, what you need, what you don't need. All of the requirements are there on that page as well. Requesting an absentee ballot. I mean, this is very straightforward, pretty much. straightforward stuff, and then there's a frequently asked questions. So there you have it as far as that's concerned. Now, I'm not so sure about whether there is, there's obviously absentee voting, so there's obviously some kind of early vote. So that is what you will see, find information on satellite absentee voting. So that is Iowa. Pretty straightforward. You go to sos.iowa.gov. And then once you get to that page, you go to the right-hand side where it says elections. You can also go down to where it says register to vote on the left. But I just think for the sake of continuity, you actually want to stay on the right-hand side of that home page and go to where it says elections. It's in small print, and you can see the choices there and follow them all as well. Voter Ready, there's another section there where you are given all kinds of resources, which I think you will find to be very helpful indeed. Let me tell you, by the way, as I find it here, that in Iowa, you can early vote. As I did say, I'll give you the specific date for early voting. The early voting date, the first day of early voting, absentee voting, for Iowa is October the 5th. That's a Monday. That's for the general election the following month. If you want to vote in the November 3rd general election early, make sure that you do so the very first day of early voting, which is Monday the 5th of October. They've got other deadlines here after that. Pre-registration deadline is October 24th. For the general election. So I'm assuming, look, if you've got questions about that, you have to contact Iowa and their Secretary of State. I think that that's what you should do. So there you have it on as far as that's concerned. First day of early voting, which is the same thing as absentee voting, is October the 5th. That's a Monday. So there you have it. That is Iowa. Next, it's going to be Dorothy. Well, not exactly Dorothy, but you know well, maybe you don't know what I mean. I am speaking about Kansas, the state of Kansas. And this is going to be of great use to you. Trust me. You would love to, if you are a Kansas voter, get the skinny, so to speak, on what you need to do. And I did not give you the deadline date to register to vote in Iowa, so you need to check that out. I will be compiling a composite list of every state, so I just want to let you know about that. So all is not lost, but I think I don't want you to wait on me. I'd rather you do what you need to do in getting that question answered. So this is what you do for Kansas. If you are in the state of Kansas, you go to KSSOS.org. KSSOS.org. That brings you to the homepage of the state of Kansas's Secretary of State. And state of Kansas Secretary of State, you've got these election dates. You'll see all kinds of things, including election dates. Scott Schwab is the Kansas Secretary of State. But the Kansas election dates that you need to know about, and there is a primary in Kansas, by the way, on Tuesday, August the 4th. And by the way, obviously the deadline for voting in that, for registering in that, has passed. But there is a primary election in Kansas on August the 4th. Now, the deadline for registering to vote in the November 3rd general election is October 13th in Kansas. Last day to register, October the 13th in Kansas, if you want to vote in the November 3rd general election. Look, let me just say this to you, please. Do not procrastinate. Register to vote right now, okay? Do not wait until October. We are just starting August, and believe me, this time is going to fly by between now and November. There's debates scheduled for next month. scheduled for next month. There may even be a debate late this month. I'm not quite sure. I think it's next month. Next month. The conventions are this month. Democratic convention's only 2 weeks away. This is crazy how quickly this has come now. You need to be ready, folks. So October 13th in Kansas is the last day to register to vote for the November 3rd general election. Early voting begins in Kansas for that general election November 3rd on October the 14th. That is when early voting in person and by mail start in Kansas State. October the 14th. And there is a deadline for voters to apply for advanced ballots by mail for the general election. So if you want to get an advanced ballot by mail, the deadline for that is October 27th. Look, I would advise you strongly, apply for that darn thing now. If you are someone who is uncomfortable voting by going in person, you can do it now. You can apply for the ballot now. But what I would do, knowing that October the 14th is the first day that you can vote in person early, I would take the chance and do that. Because I'm telling you, even though there's going to be lines, and I think there would still be considerably less lines on October 14th than there will be on November 3rd, I guarantee you, if you prepare your ballot and you know exactly what the races are and you know who's on it, you can fill that ballot out at home. You could fill out a piece of paper at home, bring that paper with you in the booth, and just transfer all of your answers onto the actual voting card or machine that you're going to be using. And believe me, it'll go twice as fast. You will not be around people for very long. There will presumably be physical distancing, and you'll be obviously told to wear a mask. So if you're one of those individuals who likes to go into a booth or go in to see what's going on, I'm one of those people. I like to go in instead of just mailing stuff off. I like to go in and just get a lay of the land and get my sticker. You know, you get that I voted sticker. Oh, I love that stuff. Oh, I got a whole collection of those. I can make a museum out of those. So that is Kansas. Advanced voting, early voting that is, begins October the 14th for the general election, which of course is on November 3rd. And the deadline to register to vote for that general election is October the 13th. That's really what you really need to know from Kansas there. And by the way, since I didn't tell you, if you want to, I didn't even tell you about this. Oh, dear. If you want to, that's just crazy. If you want to find out if you're registered to vote, and of course, I recommend that you check every week through the end of October, so that if there is an issue, you can correct it by registering to vote online. Now, pretty much every state except Arkansas, so far that I've checked, do allow you to register online. Arkansas is the only state that, from the best of what I've looked at on their website, and I read this out to you a few days back, is the only state that does not allow people to register online to vote, which I think is just crazy. But if you want to register to vote in Kansas State, then what you do is on that page, KSSOS.org, that's Kennedy Sam Oscar Sam.org. You want to scroll down, you'll see something that says elections, and there's two places to see it. One is across the top underneath the Secretary of State of Kansas, and you can click on elections there, or you can scroll down to a bigger icon that says elections underneath it, second from the left. You click on that, then you get a series of the election dates, which some of which I've just told you. Then you will see something underneath that list of dates. There's at least, from the looks of things, 12 icons. One of them is the first one on the left on the top row that says register to vote. You click on that, and away we go. You just follow the prompts from there. And next to it is voter information. You click on that icon, and then there will be registered to vote online, registered to vote by paper, registered to vote in Spanish, check your voter registration. So you go to the far right one that says, furthest on the right, that says check your voter registration, and boom, voila, you can look it all up there. And You can just enter your information. It's quite explanatory, everybody. Quite explanatory. So that's really what it boils down to, folks. Once again, you can find me on Twitter at @thepopcorn, REEL. As I said earlier, if you want to watch me on Zoom and participate in a conversation that I will be hosting on I Am Not Your Negro, the documentary from 2016 that centers James Baldwin and the 1960s, and a conversation on James Baldwin himself, then please sign up right now to be part of that Zoom conversation. And if you don't have Zoom but would like to be involved, make sure you download Zoom, the app, onto your phone, or make sure that you find a way to go online on your computer and find Zoom and go from there. Go to the website and see how you can access this feed. And you sign up at the following website address: M as in Michael, I library.org. That's MILIBRY.org/events, EVENTS. There you will see, when you scroll down a little bit, you will see a photo of yours truly, and you will see the August 7th event, I Am Not Your Negro, and you will see my bio, and you'll see an area as you scroll down underneath the bio where you can register. You'll have to enter, I think, your email address and your name. It's free of charge, of course. And once you're registered, boom, you'll get a link and you go from there. So that's this Friday, August 7th. So don't forget, if you're interested in that and being part of that conversation that I will be hosting, a conversation on I Am Not Your Negro for the Mechanics Institute in San Francisco as part of their Cinema Lit series, Black Lives on Film. The first film in the series is I Am Not Your Negro. So thank you very much indeed for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.